This episode of Ink and Imagination is brought to you by Ramblings of a Comics Fan, available now on Amazon. Welcome back to Ink and Imagination, the podcast where we peel back the panels, dive into the margins, and tell the untold stories of comic history. I'm your host, Alex K. Cossa, and today we're heading across the Atlantic, away from Gotham, Metropolis, and Marvel's Manhattan, away from the American comic book giants we so often talk about. Instead, we're stepping into a world of foggy football pitches, grim playgrounds, rainy bus stops, and corner newsagents stacked with weekly anthologies. This is Britain in the 1970s, and we're looking at the world of British comics. A world where two titles stand out in sharp contrast. The Hotspur, one of the old guard of traditional boys' adventure papers, and Action, a bold, brutal, controversial experiment that burned too brightly, too quickly. This is a story of how British comics in the 1970s reflected their times: a nation in turmoil, kids hungry for change, and an establishment terrified of what they might find in the pages of their weekly reads. Ready? Let's turn back the clock. Part 1: Britain in the 1970s, a nation in decline. Before we dive into the comics themselves, we need to set the stage. Britain in the 1970s was tense. The empire had crumbled, the economy was faltering, inflation ran wild, strikes shut down everything from coal mines to the postal service. The so-called winter of discontent saw rubbish piling up in the streets. And everywhere, class tensions bubbled. If you were a kid in working class Britain, life could feel bleak. Your parents might be struggling to put food on the table. The school system felt strict, even oppressive. The streets weren't always safe. And entertainment? You didn't have streaming or video games or even the luxury of TV channels on demand. What you had were comics. And in Britain, comics didn't mean glossy superhero books like in America. They meant weeklies, cheap, black and white anthologies packed with short strips that covered everything from sports to war to school mischief to adventure. For pennies, you could step into another world, and for decades, that world had been one of discipline and duty. Part 2: The Hotspur and the Old Guard. Let's start with the Hotspur. First launched in 1933, the Hotspur was one of the Big Five story papers published by D.C. Thompson, the Dundee-based powerhouse behind classics like The Beano and The Dandy. Originally, Hotspur was a text-heavy boys' paper. Its stories were patriotic, moralistic, often centered around schoolboy heroes, sports champions, or soldiers. By the 1950s, it transitioned to comic strip format to compete with rivals. By the 1970s, though, Hotspur was showing its age. Its story still leaned heavily on the tried and true formulas of earlier decades. Think noble British soldiers outsmarting foreign enemies, gusty schoolboys triumphing over bullies, athletes winning the big match through pluck and grit. There was comfort in those tales. They reinforced traditional values: courage, loyalty, fair play, and of course patriotism. For parents and teachers, Hotspur was safe. It was the kind of comic you didn't mind your kids reading. But the kids themselves? Well, times were changing. This was the age of punk music, of strikes and protest, of anger at the establishment, of teenagers wanting something raw, something real. By the mid 1970s, Hotspur felt like your dad's comic, and sales showed it. Enter action. Part 3. Action bursts onto the scene. If Hotspur was the stiff upper lip of British comics, Action was the clenched fist with brass knuckles. Launched in February 1976 by IPC magazines, Action was edited by a young, fiery Pat Mills, a man often credited as a godfather of modern British comics. Mills believed kids deserved stories that reflected their real lives, stories that didn't talk down to them, stories that captured the anger, the danger, and the thrill of the world they were growing up in. Action delivered exactly that. It was dubbed the comic parents hate, and it wore that badge proudly. Its strips were shocking, violent, often darkly funny, and sometimes scathing in their social commentary. Take Hookjaw, for example, a blatant ripoff of Spielberg's Jaws, except here the shark wasn't the villain. He was the anti-hero, a bloodthirsty force of nature, tearing corrupt capitalists, oil drillers, and hapless swimmers to shreds. Kids loved it. Parents were horrified. Or Kids Rule O.K, set in a dystopian Britain where a mysterious plague wiped out adults, leaving teenagers in charge. What did they do? They formed violent gangs roaming the streets fighting for territory. Then there was Look Out for Lefty, a strip about a working class footballer trying to survive on and off the pitch, balancing gritty matches with life in rough neighborhoods. It was authentic, relatable, and far removed from the polished heroes of older sports comics. These stories dripped with blood, sweat, and rebellion. And for kids growing up in the chaos of 1970s Britain, they rang true. Part 4. Panic and Backlash. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Almost immediately, Action sparked outrage. The British press ran scandalized headlines, politicians fretted, parents wrote angry letters. Critics claimed the comic would corrupt an entire generation. The most vocal opponent? Mary Whitehouse and her National Viewers and Listeners Association. Whitehouse had already built a career crusading against television violence and obscenity. To her, Action was a new front in the cultural war. And perhaps the most infamous strip of all was Kids Rule O.K, whose artwork in one issue depicted a gang of teenagers standing over the body of a policeman. That single image was enough to trigger national outrage. By autumn of 1976, just 36 issues into its run, the pressure became too much. Under threat of censorship and possible legal action, IPC pulled Action from shelves. The comic was literally withdrawn mid-print. It was the British equivalent of the American Panic over seduction of the innocent in the 1950s. A moral crusade. A moment when the establishment looked at kids' entertainment and decided, this is too much. When Action returned a few months later, it wasn't the same. The violence was gone, the social edge was blunted. Strips were rewritten, redrawn, neutered. Readers noticed, and sales collapsed. By 1977, Action was cancelled outright. It barely lived over a year, but its legacy was seismic because while action was silenced, its DNA lived on. Part 5, From Action to 2000 AD. Pat Mills didn't give up. The lessons of action that kids craved, raw, subversive stories, fueled his next project, 2000 AD. Launched in 1977, 2000 AD took the rebellious spirit of action and added a sci-fi twist. Out came Judge Dredd, the fascist lawman in a dystopian megacity. Out came Strontium Dog, Nemesis the Warlock, and countless others. 2000 AD succeeded where action failed. Maybe because its sci-fi setting gave it a plausible deniability. Maybe because it leaned into satire. Maybe because by then the tide had shifted. But the point is this. Without action, there would be no 2000 AD. Without 2000 AD, there would be no British invasion of comics in the 1980s, no Alan Moore, no Grant Morrison, no Garth Ennis rewriting the rules in America. It all started here, with one scrappy, scandalous comic that dared to give kids what they wanted. Meanwhile, what are the Hotspur? By the late 1970s, Hotspur was limping along. Its conservative, old-fashioned style couldn't compete with the raw edge of action or the shiny American superhero imports that were beginning to trickle into the UK market. In 1981, Hotspur finally merged into The Victor. By then, the age of boys' adventure papers was all but over. It was the end of an era. Part 6, Legacy and Reflection. So what do we make of this clash? On one side, Hotspur, the voice of the past, tradition, patriotism, safe escapism. On the other, Action, the voice of rebellion, brutality, grit, danger. Both reflected their times. Both had a place in British culture. But only one sparked a moral panic. And in doing so, Action paved the way for a revolution. Because comics are never just stories. They're mirrors. They reflect what society fears, what kids dream, and what the establishment wants to control. The story of Hotspur and Action is the story of Britain in the 1970s. Old traditions clashing with new rebellions, a society unsure of its future, and kids caught in the middle. That's it for today's episode of Ink and Imagination. Next time, maybe we'll keep following a thread into the 1970s and beyond, or into the late 1970s and beyond, as 2000 AD changes everything and British creators begin reshaping comics around the world. Maybe we'll look at creator rights again. I'm not sure. It depends on what interests me as we're doing the research. Until then, keep reading, keep questioning, and remember sometimes the most dangerous stories are the ones that tell kids the truth.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.